Marley was dead, to begin with. There can be no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Old Marley was as dead as a door-nail. Scrooge knew he was dead, of course he did. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, his sole mourner. Scrooge and Marley were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood years afterward above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. He answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, was Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. No man or woman ever once in all his life stopped him in the street to say, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, upon a Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting-house. It was bleak, cold, biting weather. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole. The door of Scrooge's counting-house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire. The clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal, but he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal-box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of a strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" It was the cheerful voice of Scrooge's nephew. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" "Christmas a humbug, Uncle? You don't mean that, I am sure." "Merry Christmas! Out upon a Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer? If I had my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart." "Uncle!" "Nephew, keep Christmas in your own way, and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it? But you don't keep it." "Let me leave it alone, then. Much good may it do you, much good it has ever done you." "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time as a good time, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good, and I say God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. "Let me hear another sound from you, Mr. Cratchit, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. And you're quite a powerful speaker, sir. I wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." "Good afternoon." "I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute, but I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last, so a Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon." "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon." The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let two other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?"
"Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night."
"At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute."
"Are there no prisons?"
"Plenty of prisons."
"Workhouses?"
"Sadly, I wish I could say there were not. Mr. Scrooge, we choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?"
"Nothing."
"You wish to be anonymous."
"I wish to be left alone. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the prisons and the workhouses, and those who are badly off must go there."
"Many can't go there, and many would rather die."
"If they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. It's not my business. Good afternoon, gentlemen."
The gentleman withdrew, and Scrooge resumed his labours with an improved opinion of himself. At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge, dismounting from his stool, tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat.
"You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose?"
"If quite convenient, sir."
"It is not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to stop 50 for it, you'd think yourself mightily ill-used, I'll be bound."
"It's only once a year, sir."
"A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning."
The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling. The clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, slid down Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honour of its being Christmas Eve, then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at blindman's buff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and, having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms. The building was old enough and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door of this house, except that it was very large. Also, that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face, with a dismal light about it. The hair was curiously stirred as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. He said, "Pooh-pooh," and closed the door with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, trimming his candle as he went. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he did walk through his rooms to see that all was right. Sitting-room, bedroom, lumber-room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing-gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing-gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a disused bell that hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This was succeeded by a clanking noise, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door.
"It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it."
His colour changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. The same face, the very same. Marley, in his pigtail usual waistcoat, tights, and boots. The chain he bore was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made of cash-boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent.
"How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?"
"March!"
"Who are you?"
"Ask me who I was."
"Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade."
"In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley."
"Can you sit down?"
"I can."
"Do it, then."
"You don't believe in me."
"I don't."
"Why do you doubt your senses?"
"Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheat. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!"
At this the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon.
"Mercy, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?"
"It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death."
"You are fettered, Jacob."
"I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. Is its pattern strange to you? Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself?"
"But ye were always a good man of business, Jacob."
"Business! Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business.
Oh, speak comfort to me, Jacob.
I have none to give. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Expect the first tomorrow night when the bell tolls 1. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more. It walked backward from him, and at every step it took the window raised itself a little, so that when the apparition reached it, it was wide open. Confused noises filled the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge, and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Desperate in his curiosity, Scrooge followed to the window. He looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost the power forever. Scrooge closed the window, and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. Scrooge tried to say, but stopped at the first syllable, and being, from the emotion he had undergone, much in need of repose, he went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that, looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. Suddenly the church clock tolled a deep, dull, melancholy 1. Upon the instant, light flashed up in the room, the curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them.
Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?
I am.
Who and what are you?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
Your past.
What business has brought you here?
Your welfare. Arise and walk with me. Scrooge rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, he clasped its robe in supplication.
Spirit, I am mortal and liable to fall.
Bear but a touch of my hand here, said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, and you shall be upheld in more than this. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall, and stood in the busy thoroughfare where all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was evening, and the streets were lighted up. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here, too, it was Christmas time. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door, and asked Scrooge if he knew it.
Know it? I was apprenticed here.
They went in, and beheld an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement,
Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again!
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen, and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself, and called out in a rich, fat, jovial voice, "Yahoo there, Ebenezer, Dick!" A living and moving picture of Scrooge's former self, a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow prentice.
"Dick Wilkins, to be sure, bless me. Yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me."
"Yahoo, my boys! No more work tonight! Christmas Eve, Dick! Christmas, Ebenezer! Let's have the shutters up before a man can say Jack Robinson. Haley-ho, clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here." Well, there was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away, with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk, made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers, whose hearts they broke. In came the young men and women employed in the business, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. Then away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round, in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" and the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. There were more dances, there were forfeits, and yet more dances, and there was cake, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there were mince pies, and plenty of beer. When the clock struck 11, Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. Thus the cheerful voices died away, and the 2 prentices were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back of the shop. During the whole of this time Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folk so full of gratitude. What is the matter?"
"Nothing particular. I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all."
The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Again his words produced an immediate effect. Again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a comely maiden, in whose eyes there were tears. "Ebenezer, sadly you are not the man you once were. The golden idol has displaced me. But if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve. With a full heart I release you. May you be happy in the life you have chosen." She left him, and they parted.
"Spirit, why do you delight to torture me?"
"I told you these were shadows of the things that have been. That they are what they are, do not blame me,"
"Spirit, remove me from this place. I cannot bear it." He turned upon the ghost and wrestled with it. "Show me no more. Haunt me no longer." As Scrooge struggled with the spirit, he was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom. He had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was upon the stroke of 1. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing. Consequently, when the bell struck and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and centre of a blaze of ruddy light, which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts. At last, however, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light must be in the adjoining room. He got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. It was his own room, there was no doubt about that. But the walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light as if many little mirrors had been scattered there. Heaped upon the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, and seething bowls of punch. In easy state upon this couch there sat a giant, glorious to see. "Come in!" exclaimed the ghost. "You are the ghost of Christmas present?" "That I am. Come in and know me better, man." "Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe." The room and its contents all vanished instantly. They stood in the city streets upon a snowy Christmas morning. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost that, notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could stand beneath a low roof quite as gracefully as in any lofty hall. Perhaps it was the pleasure the spirit had in showing off this power, or else it was his own kind, generous sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks. On the threshold of the door the spirit smiled, and up rose Mrs. Cratchit, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, brave in ribbons which are cheap and make a goodly show for 6 pence. She laid the tablecloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own. Basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table. At last in came Bob the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim! He bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "Good as gold," said Bob. "Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard.
He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who it was made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. This was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast of the goose. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim beat on the table with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by apple-sauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. All the Cratchit family drew round the hearth, and Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears! God bless us!" which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. "Spirit," said Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find him here." "Oh, no, Spirit, no!" "What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "Founder of the feast, indeed! I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health for your sake, and the day's not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof, and their clothes were scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, as this scene vanished, to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room with the Spirit by his side, and to hear the hearty laugh of his own nephew. If you should happen to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. There is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humour. Scrooge's nephew cried, "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live. He believed it too. He's a comical old fellow, that's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. But who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. So he loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something." There might have been 20 people there, young and old. After tea they had some music, and then there was a game at blind man's buff. They all played, and so did Scrooge, wholly forgetting that his voice made no sound in their ears.
"Now here is a new game,"
cried Scrooge, and begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what, he only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every new question put to him, the nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister cried out, "I know what it is, Fred! It is your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes. Fred laughed. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure, and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is. Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become entirely gay and light of heart, but the whole scene passed off in the breath of this last word, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because, while he remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older.
Spirits' lives so short.
"My life upon this globe is very brief. It ends tonight at midnight."
"Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?"
"It might be a claw, for all the flesh there is upon it." From the foldings of its robe it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "O man, look here! Look down here!" They were a boy and a girl. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out, they were yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish.
"Spirit, are they yours?"
"They are man's, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware of them both, and all of their degree."
"Have they no refuge or resource?"
"Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it no more. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which, concealing its head, its face, and form, left nothing of it visible, save one outstretched hand.
I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come.
The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand.
You are about to show me shadows of things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us. Is that so?
The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant, as if the spirit had inclined its head.
Spirit, I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear your company.
Suddenly the city seemed to spring up about them and encompass them of its own act. There they were in the heart of it, where merchants hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets and conversed in groups. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen.
"No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" "Last night, I believe."
"Why, what was the matter with him? I thought he'd never die."
"What has he done with his money?"
"I haven't heard. Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know."
"It's likely to be a very cheap funeral, for upon my life I don't know of anybody to go to it."
"I don't mind going if a luncheon were provided." Scrooge was surprised that the spirit should attach importance to a conversation apparently so trivial, but he resolved to treasure up every word he heard and everything he saw. The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself. The scene changed. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, and found the family seated round the fire. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. Mrs. Cratchit laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face.
"You went to die, then, Robert?"
"Yes, my dear. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child, my little child." The ghost of Christmas yet to come still did not speak, but conveyed Scrooge as before until they reached an iron gate, a churchyard walled in by houses and overrun by grass and weeds. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down.
"Before I draw near to that stone, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only?"
The ghost, immovable as ever, pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Scrooge crept forward, trembling, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge.
"Spirit, hear me! I am not the man I was. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows by an altered life. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone."
Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in.
Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. Oh, I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me.
His hands were busy with his garments all this time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties to every kind of extravagance.
I don't know what to do. I am as light as a feather, happy as an angel, merry as a schoolboy. I am as giddy as a drunken man. Merry Christmas to everybody, a Happy New Year to all the world.
Running to the window, he opened it, put out his head, and called down to a boy in Sunday clothes,
"What's to die, my fine fellow?"
"To die?" replied the boy. "Why, Christmas die."
"It's Christmas die. I haven't missed it after all. The spirits have done it all in one night. Well, they can do anything they like, of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow, do you know the poulterers in the next street but one?"
"I should hope I did."
An intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one."
"What, the one as big as me?"
What a delightful boy. It is a pleasure to talk to him.
"It's hanging there now."
"Is it? Go and buy it, and tell him to bring it here. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown."
The boy was off like a shot.
"I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim."
The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did somehow, and went downstairs to open the street door. As he stood there awaiting the arrival of the poulterer's men, the knocker caught his eye.
"It is a wonderful knocker. I shall love it as long as I live. Hello, here's the turkey."
And it was a turkey. Oh, he never could have stood upon his legs, that bird.
"Why, it's impossible to carry that to Camden Town. You must have a cab."
The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down again, breathless in his chair, and chuckled till he cried. At last he dressed himself all in his best, and got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth. Scrooge, walking with his hands behind him, regarded every one with a delighted smile. He went to church, and walked about the streets, and watched the people hurrying to and fro. He patted the children on the head, and questioned the beggars, and looked down into the kitchens of houses and up to the windows. He had never dreamed that anything could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash and did it. "Why, bless my soul!" cried the nephew. "Who's that?"
"It is I, your Uncle Scrooge. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in?"
Let him in? It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did the plump sister when she came. So did everyone when they came. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. Oh, but he was early in the office next morning, was Scrooge. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. And he did it, yes, he did. The clock struck 9, no Bob. 1/4 past, No, Bob, he was a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. His hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock.
Hallo! What do you mean by coming here at this time of day? Step this way, sir, if you please.
I was making rather merry yesterday, sir. It's only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated.
Now I tell you what, I am not going to stand this sort of thing any longer, and therefore, I am about to raise your salary.
Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it and calling to the people in the court for help and a strait waistcoat.
A Merry Christmas, Bob, a merrier Christmas, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavour to assist your struggling family. We'll discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a steaming bowl of smoking bishop. Make up the fires, Bob Cratchit, and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, at which some people did not have their fill of laughter at the outset. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. Scrooge had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us, and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one.